Thanks, Angie. And I think we're going to do our introductions in maybe alphabetical order. So Kevin, you get to go first.
Sure. Kevin Colburn. I'm the National Stewardship Director of American Whitewater based in Asheville, North Carolina.
Liz Lacy.
Hi there, I'm Liz Lacy with the National Park Service. I work on the Partnership Rivers, Wild and Scenic Rivers program.
Liz Townley.
Hi there, I'm the other Liz on the call today, and I am Liz Townley, and I work for the Forest Service in the WO as a Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers planning specialist.
My name is Dusty Vaughn. I'm a Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers specialist for the U.S. Forest Service out of the DC area, and I'll pass it over to Tangi.
Hi guys, I'm Tangi Wiseman, and I'm also based in the DC area with the Forest Service, working on the Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers program as a specialist. So Dusty and I kind of tag team.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Make sure I'm sharing the correct screen here. There we go, right. And teammates, I can't see the chat right now, so just let me know if there's any questions that pop up. Great. So welcome everyone to our to our Wild and Scenic Rivers 101 session. We'll go ahead and get started. So in the United States, there is approximately 3.5 million miles of rivers. In early America, free-flowing rivers were the lifeblood of commerce, transportation, fisheries, pathways for people to connect. Today, they are critical yet often overlooked sources of clean water, critical habitat, and rejuvenating recreation. Over 860,000 miles of river have been dammed, dredged, or channelized, or about 24% of the nation's rivers. Does anyone recognize this body of water? This is Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, or Hetch Hetchy Valley, now reservoir. And does anyone know what river it was on? It is on. It's on the Townley. Some of you may recognize this image from the film Damnation of Hetch Hetchy Valley, the site of the seminal preservation versus conservation battle with John Muir and the preservationists trying to protect this portion of Yosemite National Park on one side, and Gifford Pinchot and the conservationists arguing the reservoir was needed for the greatest good of the city and county of San Francisco to solve water shortages and aid ongoing recovery from their 1906 earthquake and fire. As our nation grew, we began to dam, dredge, and channel rivers across the landscape. By the 1950s, decades of damming, development, and diversion had taken their toll on our country's rivers. During the 1960s, the country began to recognize the damage we were inflicting on wildlife, landscapes, our drinking water, and our legacy. Some rivers literally caught on fire due to the pollution and trash in them. Proposed by such environmental legends as John and Frank Craighead, pictured here, and Olaus Murie, and championed through Congress by the likes of Senators Frank Church and Walter Mondale, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act started to form when outdoor enthusiasts and visionary congressional leaders demanded the creation of a protected system of free-flowing rivers to balance America's policy of rampant dam building. President Lyndon Johnson declared in his 1965 State of the Union message to the country that we hope to preserve unspoiled stretches of some of our waterways with a wild rivers bill. 3 years later, Congress passed this legislation, and on October 2nd, 1968, President Johnson signed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act into law, establishing a national wild and scenic river system to preserve certain rivers with outstanding natural, cultural, and recreational values and a free-flowing condition for the enjoyment of present and future generations. Let's listen in to President Johnson's comments during the signing of this act.
An unspoiled river is a very rare thing in this nation today. Their flow and their vitality have been harnessed by dams, and too often they've been turned into open sewers by communities and by industries. And it makes us all very fearful that all rivers will go this way unless somebody acts now to try to balance our river development. So we are establishing a national wild, and scenic river system, which will complement our river development with a policy to preserve sections of selected rivers in their free-flowing conditions, to protect their water quality, and to protect other vital conservation values. A few summers ago, after Secretary Udall took his lovely Flamin on a float trip of high adventure down the turbulent Colorado River, he returned to Washington, and he said that every individual and every family should get to know at least one river. So today we are initiating a new national policy which will enable more Americans to get to know more rivers. And now it gives me great pleasure to approve these bills, which I think will add still more to the scenic wealth of our country, and which I think is going to mean so much to my little grandson and all the others like him that will live in a beautiful America their lives. Thank you.
So that video clip was from the video Run Wild, Run Free, and we can post the link to that full video in the chat box here at the end. But in 1968, there were 8 instant designations. They were the Clearwater and Salmon in Idaho, the 11 Point in Missouri, the Feather in California, the Rio Grande in New Mexico, the St. Croix in Minnesota and Wisconsin, the Wolf in Wisconsin, and the Rogue in Oregon. The Flathead River, where the Craighead brothers first conceived of a Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, was one of the 27 congressionally authorized study rivers identified for further study in the Act. 219 miles of this river later added to the national system through an amendment to the Act in 1976. So the intent of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is explicitly stated in Section 1 of the law, which states, "The Congress declares that the established national policy of dam and other construction at appropriate sections of the rivers of the United States needs to be complemented by a policy that would preserve other selected rivers or sections thereof in their free-flowing condition to protect the water quality of such rivers and to fulfill other vital national conservation purposes." Recall that the Wild and Scenic Rivers story began in the 1960s when outdoor enthusiasts and visionary congressional leaders demanded the creation of a protected system to balance America's policy of rampant dam building. And today, 860,000 river miles are dammed, dredged, or channelized, or 24% of river miles. Comparatively, Congress's complement to this policy of development includes designation of 13,413 miles of free-flowing rivers under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which is slightly more than 1/3 of 1% of the total miles of rivers in the United States. Altogether, the system now includes 226 units in 40 states and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. As depicted in yellow on this map, much of the system lies in the western United States and is managed by 4 federal river administering agencies: the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Forest Service. Rivers in the National Wild and Scenic River System capture the essence of all waterways that surge, ramble, gush, wander, and weave through our country. It safeguards beloved places that define us as a nation. The shot heard round the world was fired over the Wild and Scenic Concord River in Massachusetts. Nebraska's native prairie still thrives along the Wild and Scenic Niobrara River. Wild salmon return every year to the Wild and Scenic Rogue River in Oregon, and Lewis and Clark would still recognize the Upper Missouri River in Montana. From the remote rivers of Alaska, Idaho, and Oregon to rivers threading through the rural countryside of New Hampshire, Ohio, and Massachusetts, each preserves a part of the American story and heritage. 8 rivers are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. 38 rivers are managed by the National Park Service. 41 rivers are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. 127 rivers are managed by the U.S. Forest Service, and 17 rivers are administered by states or partnerships between states and federal agencies. Wild and Scenic River designation is more than just a catchy label. It signifies our nation's commitment to protect a river for generations to come. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in Section 1B states that it is hereby declared to the policy of the United States that certain select rivers of the nation shall be preserved in free-flowing condition, and that they and their immediate environment shall be protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. It is important to note that river management didn't start with the signing of the act. People have interacted and stewarded rivers for thousands of years, and we are still learning from the depths of knowledge and relationships with these special places that have existed for a long time. Today, we will be focusing on how we manage these rivers according to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Congress partitions wild and scenic rivers into one of 3 different classifications when they're designated, based on different levels of development and access that exists at the time of the designation. The river administering agency would do so the same for the study rivers. Classifications are based on what exists today or the date of the designation, not what might be desired in the future. Wild river areas are those rivers or sections of rivers that are free of impoundments, generally inaccessible except by trail, and are vestiges of early America. Scenic river areas are rivers or sections of rivers that are free of impoundments, accessible in places by roads, but are still largely undeveloped. And recreational river areas. Rivers or section of rivers that may have had impoundments or diversions in the past and are readily accessible by road or railroad, and that may have some development along the shorelines. The term recreational may or may not connotate public recreation use on this river segment. In the context of wild and scenic river classification, it refers to the most developed class. And now I'll pass it over to Tanji.
Thanks, Dusty. Thanks for kind of laying out the foundation. So now we're going to zoom in a little bit on how these rivers are managed, and they're managed within this framework where we identify values and then we work to protect and enhance them, utilizing the legislation and other strategies. So designating a river as wild and scenic is essentially the highest form of protection that a river can get in the US or really anywhere in the world. And once a river is designated, its water quality and free flowing condition and outstandingly remarkable values also need to be protected and enhanced into the future. And so protection involves documenting the condition of the values, then monitoring them and eliminating adverse impacts. And enhancing the river values involves seeking new opportunities to actually improve their condition. And under the Act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, no federally permitted activities are allowed to degrade a protected river's values. And for this reason, communities and planning teams work together to get a clear definition of each of these values to monitor their condition over time. And just an example, if there was a riverbank alteration that was proposed and it required a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers through the Clean Water Act, before they can issue that permit on a designated stretch of river, they need to consult with the agency to ensure that that project proposal would protect or enhance the values for which the river was designated. So now we can walk through some of those values. So water quality is definitely a primary river value identified for protection in Section 1B of the Act. And in fact, 1 out of 10 people can actually trace their drinking water source back to a designated wild and scenic river. But it's important to note that the rivers don't need to have the highest water quality to qualify as a wild and scenic river, just so long as water quality can be protected or improved in the future. And water quality is connected to a lot of aspects of our lives. 60% of our body is water, and rivers connect our public lands to farms, communities, markets, and then essentially even our own bodies in that way too. So the free-flowing condition is defined in a specific way within the Act. And this free-flowing condition is in opposition, as was mentioned in the historical part, to a lot of dam building and channelization and other modifications to riverways. So the definition that's found in Section 16B quickly reads, as applied to any river or section of a river, means existing or flowing in a natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, rip wrapping, or an other modification of the river. But the previous existence of low dams, diversion works, and other minor structures for a river that's proposed to be included does not automatically bar its consideration for inclusion, provided that the intention moving forward would not be to continually authorize or encourage future construction that was there at the time. So for example, the Townley River, which was dammed to create the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, is now designated as a wild and scenic river because the sections that were dammed and flooded were excluded from the designated boundary. So now we can move on to outstandingly remarkable values. And so where these come in is essentially that the framework that's used to figure out what aspects of the river contribute most to what people really value about it, what makes it unique and what made it worthy of protection, is to identify these ORVs, outstandingly remarkable values. And they are unique or rare characteristics at a regional scale, which varies. It could be at a Forest Service unit or within a geologic region. And there is a more specific definition available for the terms unique and rare. It's also important to recognize that ecosystems are by definition interconnected. And so identifying individual values can be a really complex process, but keeping the relationship between the characteristics in mind can lead to a more successful management plan that really protects the entire river corridor. So the Act actually identifies which river-related values can qualify as ORVs. And so a few examples that are outlined in there include like the scenic values, recreational opportunities, geologic formations, the fish populations, wildlife, cultural and historic values. And then there's a whole nother category for other. So if there's other unique values that are river-related, they can be included. And so a few that have been designated before, like botany, hydrologic patterns, and paleontology. And so the term river related, because it sounds like a broad category of values that can be included, these values must be river related. And so some aspects that would need to be included is that they need to be located in the river or the shores. They also need to make a substantial contribution to the actual functioning of the river ecosystem, or they need to owe their location or existence to the river. So now we can kind of walk into a key portion of the Act that is used to manage wild and scenic rivers and to protect and enhance these values. And so Section 7 is the key way that we do that, and it's considered to be the teeth of the Act, probably proposed in part the opposition to dam building, again, projects that modify these waterways. And so what Section 7 requires is that an analysis be done of any water resource projects that involve some sort of like help or approval, like maybe a grant or a permit from an authorizing agency, either before, during, or after the project occurs. So a lot of stuff happens in river corridors. There's all kinds of proposals that happen. There's implications from climate change. There's traditional uses from tribal groups and other community members. People propose enhancement projects too, restoration. Private landowners might propose bank stabilization projects, farmers, irrigation projects, and sometimes there's emergencies, search and rescue operations. And so we use this to analyze those activities and to apply a standard to decide if that project is compatible with river values or not. So what is a water resource project? It's something that involves construction or development that would impact the free flow or any of the other values of the river. And so a lot of examples, bank stabilization, bridges, culverts, dams, dredging and excavation, fish habitat modifications, gravel mining, levees, pipelines, boat ramps, fishing piers. I'm sure any hydro engineers would give you even more on that list. But so in order to manage these project proposals, Section 7 doesn't actually just apply to the designated segments of the rivers. If a project takes place on or near a protected segment, and that could be a designated one or one that's designated to be studied, then a Section 7 analysis is necessary under certain circumstances. So in the next slide, I'll walk through a few of the standards that are applied to these different project locations and designated segments. So here are a few of the analysis standards that are used after a project is analyzed, and essentially they're based on project location and then the designation status of that segment. And it's also key to note that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission often proposes hydropower projects that were proposed through the Federal Power Act. And so they get their own standard, and essentially they're not allowed, if they're on or directly affecting the river, you cannot build a huge dam in the middle of a wild and scenic river. But the next three standards apply to other types of projects. And so the direct and adverse effect standard is applied to projects that are proposed on the actual protected segment. And if the impacts of that project have an adverse effect on the river values, then that project cannot proceed. So the bottom two standards use the word invade. So they're used for projects that are proposed upstream, downstream, or even on a tributary to a protected segment. And then the second half of that statement, diminish versus unreasonably diminish, is made a distinction for other categories of rivers and designated rivers. So in order to provide a greater protection to study segments during their short-term study process, any project that diminishes the values at all is not allowed. While for designated rivers, the term unreasonably is added in there to add for a little bit more flexibility for those project proposals. But overall, like for Section 7 to function successfully in practice, there needs to be a lot of relationship building before and after a designation. So the more adjacent landowners know about this process and about the values for the river and what kind of engineering techniques can be used to have projects that are compatible with those values, the better this goes. And really most of the work should be done before the proposal is even on the table. And it's just important to, again, anticipate those kinds of proposals during the planning process. And that's definitely a key. And just a quick example for if erosion is really rampant in the river corridor, and there's a bunch of private landowners having concerns about that, anticipating those kinds of like bank stabilization projects, proposals ahead of time would be really important in this case. But now I will hand it over to our next presenter to keep walking us through this act.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, Liz.
Okay, thanks. I was getting a little bit of an echo. Again, my name is Liz Townley and I'm with the Forest Service, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of our agency requirements related to wild and scenic rivers. So the first is that for any wild and scenic river, Section 3B of the Act identifies that we must establish a detailed river corridor, most often within 1 year of date of designation. In addition to that, we need to prepare a comprehensive river management plan, which we most often refer to as a CRMP, and usually that's required within 3 years of date of designation. So both of these processes must be made public, not just as a requirement, but really as an opportunity to engage community members, special interest groups, and landowners on how the river will be managed going forward. Next slide. So I mentioned these CRMPs in the last slide, and so what are these, right? So these plans must address several items. So one is, you heard Tanji talk about that outstandingly remarkable values, or ORVs. And so we must address that through what we usually call a river values report. We also need to understand what the goals are for these ORVs. How can we best meet that protect and enhance mandate for those values? And this term is usually referred to as desired conditions. These plans also need to address land and facility development, water quality and in-stream flow, user capacities, which I'll talk a little bit more about. It needs to identify regulatory authorities, and it needs to identify monitoring commitments that we make not only to ourselves, but to the public as well. Next slide. Yeah, okay. So I mentioned boundaries. The default is that we have a 1/4 mile on each side when it's designated. But then we must also utilize that public process that I mentioned to establish the boundaries of no more than 320 acres per river mile. I mentioned user capacities in the previous slide. And so, user capacities gets its own slide because, this is one of the more controversial elements of a CRMP. I'm sure this is no surprise to anyone here, but it's because it represents a really major multiple use conflict, striking a balance between providing access and use of public lands with the need to manage the resource. In this case, under a protect and enhance mandate. So, each one of these slides today really oversimplifies a much larger story, and this one is no exception. So without going into too much detail, just note that it's an important part and requirement of the CRMP process. Okay, so another agency requirement is under 5D of the Act, where it identifies that agencies must consider and evaluate rivers on lands that they manage for potential designation while preparing their broader land management plans. So for the Forest Service, this might be forest plans, and for the BLM, that would most likely be a RMP or Resource Management Plan, or LMP, Land Management Plan. So this process is called eligibility and suitability, each term representing a really distinct and separate process and outcome. And eligibility can really be overgeneralized as an inventory of existing conditions. So the purpose of the eligibility is to do an evaluation of whether a river is free flowing and possesses one of those, one or more of those ORVs that you've heard a lot about today. So if found eligible, a candidate river is then analyzed as to its current level of development, also something Tanji talked about earlier. So those would be water resource projects, shoreline development, accessibility, that kind of thing. And then a recommendation is made that it can be placed into one or more of 3 classes: wild, scenic, or recreational. But there's another step to this process, right? So the final step, which is more procedural in nature, is suitability. And again, overgeneralizing here, provides the basis for determining whether to recommend a river as part of the national system. So a suitability analysis is designed to answer things like, should the river's free-flowing character, water quality, and ORVs be protected, or are there competing resources or activities that need to be considered? Additionally, will these river values be protected through designation? Is that the best method for protecting the river corridor and river values? And then lastly, things like, is there a demonstrated commitment to protect the river by any non-federal entities who may be partially responsible for implementing protective management? So I think it's important to note that not all rivers studied are found eligible or suitable for designation. Many rivers will not be included in the national system, but the process is an agency requirement, and one we felt like was worth noting. So with that, I'll pass this on to Kevin to share a little bit more about how rivers are designated.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, so obviously we don't want to stop with just the interim protection of eligible and suitable rivers, but get to that permanent designation that actually adds rivers to the wild and scenic river system. And part of the reason for that, I once asked two people high up in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, hey, could you license a dam on an eligible stream? And one of them said yes, and the other one said no at the exact same time. So there's some uncertainty there. And the best way to resolve that for future generations is through designation. There's 4 basic approaches to designating a wild and scenic river. There's flexibility here, just as there is in the rest of the act. So by far the most common way to designate a stream is through a direct act of Congress. It is in its simplest form, an amendment to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, adding a river to the list. There's another process called study rivers that it also is an act of Congress that requires the agency to go study the river for up to 3 years and then come back, report to Congress, and then it requires a second act of Congress to designate the stream. So that's the second pathway. The third is a partnership river route, which also requires typically a study river act followed by a designation act. So it's following that study river process, but with a slightly different flavor, different components to the studies. And then the fourth is the only non-congressional pathway. This is section 2A(II) of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which allows the governor of a state to request the Secretary of Interior designate a river that's already been designated as a state scenic river. So it's a state scenic river, the governor applies to the Secretary of Interior asking for designation. The Secretary then asks the Park Service to go through a NEPA process, do public outreach, and then if the Secretary of Interior believes that the river should be designated, it can simply be added to the list. And that creates a framework for river management that, like partnership rivers, are a little bit different than the ones that are a direct act of Congress. Next slide. So all of these pathways require sort of a basic body of work from the public. And somebody has to have the idea. There's no process that just automatically leads to a wild and scenic river. So somebody has to say, I want to do this, or a group of people. And then essentially they slowly build momentum towards congressional or secretarial action. It starts out usually with reaching out to partner organizations, maybe raising a little funding, then we're reaching out to individual members in the community, and then building up sort of a suite of media, website, just your basic campaign materials. And then you kind of work your way up through an engagement pyramid from, normal everyday citizens up through key landowners, businesses, and individuals, and then up through the political level seeking endorsements. Eventually, hopefully, you get a senator or congressman to introduce a bill, and that kicks off the Schoolhouse Rock, how bill becomes a law process that can take years. It can take up to a decade for this whole process to play out. It takes a ton of work, ton of dedication. I often describe it as you push on a door until someone unlatches it, and then you fall through the door. But like if you're not pushing the whole time, you might miss the window of opportunity when the door is unlocked. So it's a lot of work. Next slide.
Kevin, there is a question in the chat for you.
Okay.
Question regarding direct designation of a river. Does that mean there is no need for a study, or is that kind of rolled into the action of a CRMP being formed?
Correct. There is no need for a study. So most rivers these days are just designated straight up, and then the studies come afterwards. Oftentimes, the agencies will testify, and they can bring in information from eligibility inventories or suitability determinations that they've already done. And the advocates also from the public will bring in information and testimony, but there's no study process until the CRMP.
Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, so we're delighted right now to have probably the largest body of wild and scenic rivers in Congress waiting for designation. And this is basically the culmination of more than a decade of work by dozens and dozens of people. And I'm just going to run through some of the major bills right now in Congress that we hope to pass in the next 2 to 4 years or longer. On the Washington State's Wild Olympics, on the Olympic Peninsula, there's 19 rivers. We're just going to kind of click through these, Dusty. In Oregon, there's the Oregon Rivers Democracy Act. Without a doubt, just a massive wild and scenic rivers bill, but one we're really excited about with 4,700 miles of rivers. In California, there's 3 wild and scenic bills at least, topping 600 river miles. They're all at different stages in Congress right now. In New Mexico, there's a bill in the Gila wild and scenic, or the Gila watershed to protect the Gila River and numerous tributaries totaling 450 miles. A little further north in Montana, there's the Montana Headwaters Legacy Act, which I've worked on quite a bit. And there's over 300 miles on 17 rivers just north of Yellowstone National Park in that bill. Here's a partnership river that's in Congress right now, the York River in Maine, 30 miles. And then the last one, and this is not an exhaustive list, it's just sort of some of the high points, the Kissimmee River Wild and Scenic River Study Act. So this is one that kicks off the study process for a partnership river. Next slide. So all told, over 6,400 miles. We really hope to grow the system. As Dusty pointed out earlier, the goal of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was some sort of balance or parity between development of rivers and protection of rivers. We've got a long way to go. We're excited about it, and we're excited to work with all of you about it. So, and then Liz is going to teach you a little bit and tell you a little bit more about partnership rivers.
Hi there. I'm still muted, I think.
You're good.
I'm good?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So hi, Liz Lacy here again from the National Park Service, and I have the pleasure of working on Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, which are kind of a subset of the big stream of wild and scenic rivers across the country. The partnership approach to managing wild and scenic rivers emerged over time as rivers with extensive private land ownership were added to the National Wild and Scenic River System. This approach combines federal agency technical and financial support with community stewardship and protection for locally important rivers. Comprehensive river management plans are approved prior to designation, and enabling legislation prohibits federal land acquisition. The partnership approach provides a model for the designation of additional wild and scenic river segments on non-federal lands with the same protections as other wild and scenic rivers in the system. Most of the early designations into the National Wild and Scenic River System were rivers that flow through big public lands in the Western United States. None of the original 8 rivers that were designated were located in the private lands dominated Northeast. It was not until the mid-1970s that Congress designated any rivers east of Wisconsin, and even then, designated rivers such as the Chattooga, Obed, and Middle Delaware flowed primarily through state or federally owned lands. There are pretty significant differences between the traditional wild and scenic rivers and partnership wild and scenic rivers. With traditional wild and scenic rivers, they're mostly on federal lands. They're managed by federal agencies, and they're part of a unit, usually a park or a forest or a refuge. Partnership wild and scenic rivers, in contrast, have no acquisition of federal land. They're managed through a locally led partnership with federal support, and local land use laws and private property rights are maintained in those areas. Congressional studies under 5A increasingly are considering possible designation into the national system following the partnership river model. There are several key principles common to all the partnership rivers. No new federal land ownership resulting from the designation, administration and governance through local river councils, land use governed by existing local and state law and regulations, and there's a locally developed river plan that is approved before designation, and it guides the future management. Management responsibility is shared among local, state, federal, and nonprofit organizations. Voluntary participation by partners creates success in this way, And federal assistance and funding to implement river management plans is offered. So we have a lengthy list now of all these rivers. The first one being the Great Egg Harbor River in New Jersey, which was the first example of a partnership wild and scenic river in 1992. We have another kind of odd type of addition to the partnership wild and scenic rivers, and that's the Westfield River in Massachusetts, which is actually a state administered river through the 2A II approach, as Kevin mentioned before. But that's grouped with partnership rivers because it has a partnership management style and was able to get congressional funding through advocacy through one of its congressional members. Three more partnership wild and scenic rivers were designated in 2019 under Public Law 116-9, the Nashua, Squanicook, and Nissitissit rivers in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, the Wood-Pawcatuck rivers in Rhode Island and Connecticut, and the Lower Farmington River and Salmon Brook in Connecticut. Under the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers model, the National Park Service and a locally based stewardship council made up of municipal, state, and other stakeholders implement projects to protect and enhance each designated river and its outstanding resources. The rivers boast varied geology, healthy forested landscapes, excellent fishing and paddling opportunities, diverse plant and animal communities, historic landmarks, and riparian scenery. As of 2019, the National Park Service administers a number of partnership rivers in 10 states, all located east of the Mississippi. And as Kevin mentioned before, Congress may soon consider legislation to designate the York River in Maine as a partnership river, and we're looking forward to that. So there are benefits of the partnership wild and scenic designation that many municipalities, businesses, residents, and landowners along partnership wild and scenic rivers have identified that accrue to the local communities as a result of their designation and the designation in this way. Among the benefits are a CRMP, which is generated during the study process, and it can be used regardless of whether the river eventually gets designated or not. There's usually national recognition and prestige brought to the river. There's a boost to the local economy, especially if it's used for being promoted that way. And let's see, there's also an increased ability to leverage additional grants for a range of activities such as fish passage enhancement, land protection, and youth education. There's agency review of federally assisted water resources projects to protect locally identified river values, and a locally appointed river council that provides long-term framework to guide future management across the local jurisdictions. So it's a very effective and growing program. And if you need to hear any more about it, let me know. Take it away, Tanji, for the next section.
Hey guys, so yeah, we're just gonna walk through a few other activities and groups that work around wild and scenic rivers. And so an interagency coordinating council was formed in 1995 in order to strive for a more consistent interpretation of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act across 4 agencies, who also have to consider their own internal policies and other, organizational unique things that make them organizationally unique. And so they also have the goal to maintain the national system as really a global model for river conservation. And so essentially this council includes reps from all 4 agencies who tackle policy and management questions. They get resources together, they form task teams, and they're still just kind of trying to walk through all of these different intersections and complexities that come up within management and the ways that you can apply and interpret the act. And one of the products of the council is rivers.gov, which is a comprehensive spot to learn all about wild and scenic rivers. And here you can find information on the act and the system. A really key document or tool that people really enjoy is the Q&A search tool. There's also like a comprehensive list of, I don't even know how many questions are in there, but yeah, they're all the pointed specific questions about how certain aspects of the act intersect and how to apply in all these detailed situations. It gives you a really comprehensive look if you wanted to take a deep dive or see if other people have asked similar questions to you. You can also find policy and management direction on there. So another key resource is an actual like Section 7 flowchart, which helps managers decide which standard to apply and what the analysis looks like. And there's also a separate technical paper on Section 7 too, and other aspects of the Act. And so there is a whole tab for resources and additional technical papers. And then other resources that are on there include like communication toolkits, including Spanish from the 50th anniversary. There was a lot of collaboration with partners and a lot more engagement to get people aware of this really cool resource. So there's a lot of stories and videos on there as well. So when it comes to the work that's done on and around wild and scenic rivers, there's a wide range. I mean, there's that public engagement piece, engagement and education, monitoring work needs to be done, permitting, maintaining facilities, and making management decisions, and many more, depending on where you're at and the unique needs of your community. But more within the recreational realm, the types of jobs that are available include river rangers. There's also river managers for certain busy and iconic rivers and watersheds. Outfitters and guides also work in and around wild and scenic rivers. And then more on the science and aquatics end of the spectrum, there's hydrologists and technicians that assist them to get this water quality data and statistics on the free-flowing qualities. And then there's also fisheries biologists because wild and scenic rivers definitely protect a wonderful harbor of different native fish species too. And then there's also partner organizations that do a lot of great work. So Kevin can tell you more about a few of those and the nature of that work and job opportunities there too.
Yeah, I just add to, if you're interested in jobs in wild and scenic rivers, join RMS, and they've got a great listserv and job board. And same thing with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Coalition. It's a great way to network. In the nonprofit world, a lot of us hire folks to do outreach work. Like the designation campaigns all require a ton of conversations with local stakeholders and communities. And it's a great way to learn the act and learn how it affects people on the ground, is to be part of that. There's also jobs in stewardship, where you're out helping agencies through nonprofits work on rivers, whether it's trail maintenance or invasive species or all kinds of stuff like that. And then of course there's some policy jobs high up, but keep an eye out. I'd say RMS is probably the best job listserv right now.
And with that, we want to say thank you for sitting through our presentation here today. I really want to thank my cohort of Kevin and Liz and Tangi for joining me in this presentation effort. And Angie, I think before we throw up the poll, I think we wanted to pause. I can turn off my screen share and see if there are any questions from anyone in the audience.